Thanks for the wrap-up, and or whatever that is. And it's certainly great to be spreading the Act, Belong, Commit message around Australia, and thank Terry for putting it together, and all her staff, and Jeff, and Dennis for the welcome, and Ivan. And it really did surprise me that there were 75 odd people signed up to come along, but it shows that people are interested in these sorts of things, and I think the reaction we've got back in our own state and Victoria now attests to the strengths of a campaign that actually grows up. When we planned this campaign, we never actually planned a way it would roll out, so it's all evolved rather than being planned right from the start. But what I'll do today is go through from how it all began, the pilot study that we conducted in Western Australia. Can you all hear me all right down there?
Just a little bit.
Yep.
Get close to the mic, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I hope I don't burst out into song now. Go through the pilot campaign, some of the results, and then what we're doing in the statewide rollout. I call it a community-based social marketing campaign because it really does have its roots in community organisations and community activities. There is a mass media umbrella campaign to it that sensitises people to on-the-ground activities, legitimises them, and provides actually a sense of meaning, and people are actually implementing the campaign too. The marketing orientation is that it's an exchange process with us. It's not like a fruit and veg or a quit campaign where the health promotion officers get given a whole lot of materials, get given instructions on what to do, and then they implement it. This is really going to organisations and saying, well, what can we do for you in return for you adopting and promoting our messages? So that's the marketing orientation to it. So these are our funders along the bottom there, the Healthway, the Health Promotion Foundation in Western Australia, which is the equivalent to Vic Health, WA Country Health Services, and more recently the Mental Health Division, who's decided to support us, Lottery West, and the university itself provides some infrastructure support. The whole notion here, the Act, Belong, Commit messages and so on, are very much grounded in people's own perceptions of the determinants of good mental health and of ill health, and also consistent with the theory and academic research. When we did this research, although I'm a psychologist, I'm not a clinical psychologist, and my interactions with mental health and other sorts of things were through people with mental illnesses, but not from an academic or a psychological background. So we did our own research with people's perceptions of mental health and mental illness, and then we went to the literature afterwards. So we developed a grounded theory, but as you'll see, we found out that what people thought about the factors influencing good and bad mental health were the same sorts of things that the sociologists, psychiatrists and psychologists did. And then we looked at the literature, what's the evidence for the basis of our message, and there's a whole lot of it out there, which I'm sure some of you are very familiar with.
Keeping mentally healthy is just as important as staying physically healthy, and it's as easy as ABC. Act, Belong, Commit. Act. Keep physically and mentally active. Belong. Keep up friendships, join in club and community events. Commit. Support a good cause. And help others. Keeping mentally healthy helps you cope better with problems and stress. You'll simply feel happier too.
So that really sums up what the campaign is about. That was the ad that we introduced in the second year of the pilot study, trying to get across the branding so the balloons are floating around and so on to pick up those three messages of Act, Belong, Commit. So Act clearly refers to be active in as many ways as you can, physically, socially, cognitively, spiritually, and we promote taking a walk, doing a puzzle, doing some gardening. Any of those sorts of things fall under the Act. A sense of belonging, one of the basic fundamentals in psychology, necessary for good mental health. So join up with your friends, family, community events, participate in professional organisations, whatever, and commit to activities that you're already engaged in, take up challenges, take up causes, engage in sort of meaningful activities. So making the world happier, one cake at a time. All right. So that it's a fairly straightforward message. You can sort of act by reading a book, you can belong by joining a book club, you can commit by becoming the secretary or treasurer of the book club, or going and reading to people who can't read themselves, or read some of the philosophers perhaps instead of the Robert Ludlums or other the sort of pulp fictions of these things. So you can take a walk, or you can join a walking group. You can then get into orienteering, or you can set goals, or you can take people out in a wheelchair and take them on the walks, whatever. These things pick up very easily, and even when we first launched this, a shock jock from Darwin, of all places, rang me and said, yeah, you know, Dr. Donovan, what's this thing you're doing now at the moment, you know, act, belong, commit, thing. So I went through that, and he was carrying on, or what do you do, etc. And then at the end, he gave a great summation in almost exactly the same way as I did it then. So it's a very simple message, but it's the sort of thing that people do relate to. So how did it all begin? Well, way back in the early 2000s, Victoria had started their Together We Do Better campaign, and certainly looking at mental health promotion, as other organisations around the world were, as the costs of mental illness were going up. And although physical health promotion had dominated, but certainly successful in terms of prevention, getting people to stop smoking and eat less saturated fats and so on, looking at lung cancer and heart disease, but very little had been done on the prevention of mental illnesses. So people started to look at that. But Healthway, rather than following on from Victoria, said, well, let's commission our own research and find out, before we start a campaign, what do people think and know about mental health and those factors. So we did two areas to the research, firstly with members of the public. But what was also important was to talk to key stakeholders in the mental illness and mental health areas, because too often people jump the gun, and particularly in these social areas, in terms of running campaigns, fancy mass media advertising and so on, whereas the sector is struggling with resources and meeting demand as it is. So you run a campaign on domestic violence or child abuse, and essentially what you do is increase the workload of people in the sector. So unless you make it a whole comprehensive thing where you put in services in place at the same time as running the things, it won't work. So at this same time here, we talk to people in the mental health sector about what their attitudes would be towards running a positive mental health promotion campaign. And then, of course, we took the advice to the Healthway board as to what we should do. In a nutshell there, the stakeholders, in fact, were very positive. In fact, many of them said, well, this is long overdue. You know, smoking, diet, all these other sorts of things have been getting a Guernsey. It's time mental health promotion and prevention of mental illnesses was put on the agenda in a community-wide campaign. So that was a very good outcome for us. We did a number of focus groups right throughout the state with young people, old people, people who are retired, people unemployed and so on. And if you want to go to our report, there's a very nice complicated grounded theory model there of factors influencing positive and negative mental health. But this was our key finding, and that was that it didn't matter whether people were young or old, blue collar, white collar, employed, unemployed and so on, or lack of education or higher education. They virtually all had similar understanding of mental health concepts. Now, they may not have been as salient in some as others, but when you put it all together, and I call this The Wisdom of Crowds, if you've ever read that book, it's a really good book. It's a sort of reaction against the foolishness of crowds. But essentially they had those same beliefs. So we might say to people, what's really important about a child and their upbringing and making them resilient later on? And somebody would say, you've got to love them. You've just got to hug them, kiss them, put your arms around them, tell them you love them every day. And somebody might say, well, that's important, but I think they need to know sort of right from wrong so you can channel them down. You know, tell them not to do this, tell them to do this and other thing. And the rest of the people would nod and say, yeah, that is important too. And somebody might say, well, I think it's important to let them make mistakes, let them climb the tree, let them fall, let them get off their bike and go down and do things. And that way they learn and you can interact with them, and other people would nod along too. So the first person who was focused on love may never have consciously thought of those other things, but when somebody else mentioned, they would nod along and say, yep, that's right. So what this told us actually was all very good news, that when we went out with messages about what influences good mental health and what influences or makes you vulnerable to mental illnesses, that people already had a bit of an understanding. What we would do is legitimise it, make it more salient and bring it together as something more coherent. People also realised that, you know, there were certain individuals had different sorts of outlooks on life. So there were external factors that influenced your mental health and your sort of individual ones. This says, I just know he's thinking that I'm thinking that he's thinking that I don't know what to say and I'm totally pathetic because I keep thinking it's Tuesday. And they also realised that while some events caused you distress and made you vulnerable to mental illness, not all events were necessarily traumatic. And as Epictetus told us a couple of centuries ago, it's not events so much that cause us distress, but how people react to them. So that's an ad for Volkswagen, which turns that around. In fact, as one woman said to me in one of the groups that after my divorce, I was very distressed, very upset. I went for a long walk, though, along the beach. And at the end of that, I thought, actually, thank Christ he's gone. Now I can actually get on with my life. But it's not always like that, of course. How did we get to the brand of Act, Belong, Commit? Well, given the complexity of this area, when we started to say, well, we will do a mental health promotion area, but where do you start? Like a quit or a 2 fruit and 5 veg or a belt up or drink safe or something like that. Or even Together We Do Better or Friends Are Good Medicine. So where do you start? And we would talk to people, and because as soon as you start to mention mental health, people of course have connotations of mental illness. And one of our first objectives was to reframe that, because one of the questions we asked in our groups was, as a way of opening up the discussion, if it was Physical Health Week next week in Brisbane or Toowoomba or whatever, what would people be talking about? Who would be on the news? What would be the topics and so on? And in that case with physical health it was very easy. They come out and say, you know, getting the right exercise, eating right, sleeping right and so on. So then we would say, well, what if it was Mental Health Week next week in Brisbane? What would people be talking about? Who would be there? What would be the topics and so on? And of course they came out with things like, well, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, institutions, medication, drugs and all those sorts of things. So we knew immediately we had to reframe mental health from mental illness, and of course we've done a good job on that. I mean, we do call it the mental health sector. If you go to a hospital, they don't call it the heart health sector, they call it the cardiovascular disease section. But if you go there with a mental illness, you go to the mental health area. So we have to reframe that, and we have to constantly do that, which is why we called ourselves Mentally Healthy WA. Because when we said to people, imagine a mentally healthy person, they were alert, active, engaged, interested, and all those other positive sorts of things. So when we get people talk to us and say, what's this all about? Mental health promotion or something? We say, yes, it's about keeping people mentally healthy. We're Mentally Healthy WA, to keep rephrasing that. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of coming back to all this. We sort of say, well, how do we get a slogan that encapsulates what we want people to do? And we were sitting around and saying, well, we've got to make it easy. We've got to make it easy as ABC. And then, of course, it just bubbled up from the research. So that these were the sorts of things that people told us. So when we said, well, what makes or keeps people mentally healthy? And in the qualitative research, we actually had to ask first, what makes people unhealthy, mentally unhealthy? Because often people don't think about the positive aspects, but they know all about the bad ones. So we would first say, well, imagine a mentally ill person, what are they like, and then how did they get that way, and all the factors that impinge on them. Well, what makes or keeps people mentally healthy? And of course, one of the main things that came out there was simply activity. People mentioned all sorts of things, making sure you got out, walked down the streets and so on. And this was a quote from a bereaved older woman who still going through the grieving process of losing her husband, but she said, I sit around at the kitchen table not wanting to do anything, and then I think to myself, if I don't go out and do something, I'll go mad. So I get up, I go down the shops, I talk to people at the post office, I go out here if there's something in town, I read the paper, I just get out, I just do something out in the garden.